Welcome back to the Mina Show featuring Lenny, only NFL podcast. One of the hosts thinks the name of the Steelers offensive coordinator is Arthur Smith. That's Lenny. I'm Mina Kimes. Speaking of Arthur, now I'm going to call it Arthur Smith forever. Speaking of Arthur Smith and the Steelers, this is our first division preview. And Robert Mays, who is joining me from the Athletic Football Show, really couldn't have timed this any better because the Steelers decided to make a ton of news this week in what would seem like it was going to be a dead week. How are you doing over there? You guys tape a lot, I know. Has this thrown your whole schedule into tumult?
Yes, a little bit, but that's okay. You know, we're in the same boat here. It's the summer. We're banking stuff in advance. We're trying to fit all the puzzle pieces together, and something like this is going to throw a wrench into it. But I'm going to take a layup on June 30th when they're going to give us things to talk about it. I'm not going to complain about that.
Yeah, well, we're literally talking. So it was actually perfect timing because this is a first division preview. We agreed to the AFC North, and this most dramatically affects the AFC North. Obviously, it also affects the Miami Dolphins, as well as their decision to trade for Darren Waller. Before we get to the Steelers side, because we're not going to talk about the Dolphins. I'm going to do the AFC East. I'll talk about Minkah Fitzpatrick on the Dolphins there, which I do think is legitimately interesting. Just give me just what was your reaction to seeing Darren Waller on your social timeline this morning?
The Dolphins, could they be any weirder? Like this Dolphins team, I truly don't have any idea what to make of it. And I said something about that on social media, and I think people took that to mean I thought the Dolphins were going to be terrible. And people are like, they're going to be better than you expect. And I was like, no. This isn't about quality. This is about my complete inability to understand what they're trying to accomplish and how they're going to get there.
You know what? They're like your friend who everybody criticizes for something. Like maybe I don't know. This is very sticking with the Dolphins theme. Maybe you have a friend who wears shorts to formal outings and your other friends stage an intervention. They're like, hey, dude, maybe you should wear pants sometime. And he shows up at a wedding in the shortest shorts you've ever seen just to spite everybody. That's how I feel about the Miami Dolphins. And this move, they're committing to the bit of being the Miami Dolphins. I don't know, man. I don't like, it's hard to talk about because I agree. I don't think they're even bad. I think the offense is going to be good with or without Darren Waller, but this doesn't make this logical.
I totally agree. And I think the offense, if things break right, the idea of, and listen, the Jonas Savaiinaea trade, like I've talked about this way too much over the last 3 or 4 months, like it's indefensible. Like if you look at the makeup of the Dolphins roster, they have no players under rookie contracts, none. They have the lowest number in the league. They did not make any draft picks for like 2 years. And at some point you have to start accounting for that. Trading away mid-round picks to move up for interior offensive linemen is not a way to do that. But if you look at the roster just on its own, him plus James Daniels if he comes back healthy, and if Patrick Paul can do something, there's a chance this is the best offensive line we've ever seen with Mike McDaniel in Miami. You combine that with the skill position players. If the quarterback stays healthy, they absolutely could be good on offense. But let's not talk about the cornerback room and how the defense is supposed to offset any of that.
I'm hoping by the time I get to the AFC East, they'll have signed, I don't know, Sante Samuel Jr. or whatever. But okay, that's enough Miami Dolphins talk. We're here to talk about the Steelers. Really, it's so you and I were chatting a little bit before we started recording. What I love about player trades is they really are two teams betting on talent. Now, I think for Miami, there was financial reasons as well. They did both of these trades, to be honest, particularly with regards to Jalen Ramsey. And by the way, Dolphins fans, if you're seething, kudos to you for not eating his salary. I thought they were going to have to. So that's a win for your front office. But anyways, clearly, though, the Steelers thought Jalen Ramsey was a better fit for their defense than Minkah Fitzpatrick. I find that really interesting. Clearly, Arthur Smith coveted Jonnu Smith. He's like his Devontae. He's like his Randall Cobb, maybe. Who should?
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah, it's Devontae Adams is worth chasing every single year. Yeah, we could argue about the veracity of chasing Jonnu Smith every single year, even though he was very good last season. It was worth acknowledging.
I saw him at the Pro Bowl in Orlando last year, and I really, they were wearing their t-shirts, not their jerseys, right? And it took me a second. I had never seen him without his helmet on. I realized it took me. I was like, who is that tight end? And I was like, oh God, of course, Jonnu Smith, who did have a great season. So let's talk about him in the Steelers offense first, and then we'll talk about Jalen and the defense. So right now, It's obviously Aaron Rodgers, wide receiver group, DK Metcalf, Calvin Austin, Robert Woods, Roman Wilson. I don't even know what order to name those guys other than DK Metcalf, but there you go. Tight ends, notably, and this is where I want to start with you. Freiermuth, Darnell Washington, Jonnu Smith. The run game, the running back room has been changed. Of course, they drafted Caleb Johnson, Jalen Warren, Kenneth Gainwell is now on the Steelers. And then the offensive line, which we should talk about at length. Broderick Jones, Sam Alu, Zach Frazier, Mason McCormick, Troy Fautanu. I think that's how they're going to be oriented. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the tight ends first. This was a team that used a ton of 12 or 13 personnel last year, unsurprisingly. I think 6th highest rate of 13 in the NFL. How do you think those 3 tight ends fit together? And do you think that Jonnu Smith with Aaron Rodgers as the quarterback adds something to this offense that could help it?
I do. I actually do like this from a football perspective. And it's the reason for that is I think that both Jonnu Smith and Pat Freiermuth are more move tight ends, right? So you could say they're a little bit redundant in that way, but they're very different players stylistically. Like Freiermuth is kind of a seam runner and that piece within your offense. That's not really what Jonnu Smith is. And if you look at the makeup of the Steelers offense, this isn't the sort of group that has the receiving talent to be like a conventional drop back team and be successful. And I think what Jonnu Smith does, he pushes you into a realm of weirdness that I think this team needs to occupy for them to be okay offensively. And they didn't run a ton of screens with the Steelers last year. Arthur Smith has never been a big screen guy, but I'm just thinking of the best application of Jonnu Smith. Screens, slide routes, anything you can do to get the ball in his hands and let him go to work after the catch. They didn't have that skill set within the offense. And I think they're going to need to have that sort of skill set in order to produce even a passable passing game. And so that idea of him just being this weird player in a weird group and that being the best path for them, I can actually get on board with that pretty easily.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I actually liked this part maybe the best of it. I maybe because I think Minkah Fitzpatrick, Jalen Ramsey, they're not similar players, but I think the level of improvement is weirdly like I don't think Jalen Ramsey dramatically improves it or Minkah vice versa. Whereas Jonnu, I was like, oh, like I like this. I like it because what you said, which is, first of all, okay, I want to see which team used the most 13 personnel last year. What was it? The Cardinals, probably. I have True Media open, and as
Steelers were at 40% multiple tight end sets last year when you combine 12 and 13, which I think was one of the highest in the leagues, if not the highest.
So it was the Cardinals at 15.6. I want the Steelers to top 20. I want them to break 13 personnel records. I want, leave DK on the field or whatever, because I'm in agreement with you. I think the 3 of them work well together, and they do different things in the offense, and putting them on the field at the same time with a quarterback who's incredibly cerebral and good at diagnosing matchups, it makes sense to me. I think we both agree too that for an Aaron Rodgers offense to succeed in 2025, they have to run the football well, and the ball's got to come out quick out of his hands. Yeah. If those 2 things don't happen, this is dead on arrival. Jonnu Smith, to me, he's not a great blocker, but as an outlet for Rodgers, guy who can get you yards after the catch, guy who can you line up in the backfield, makes a ton of sense. And like you said, Freiermuth is he's probably the most traditional of the bunch. But yeah, I actually feel like when I think about this quarterback and what it takes to succeed, that to me also helps this make more sense, because I think if you think about the offense through this lens, it actually has an identity, and that identity makes sense to me.
If I'm trying to figure out the best parallel for this offense, the best comparison, like if this works out, this is what it would look like. I go back to like the 2020 Browns. Think about the construction of those teams when they had Harrison Bryant and David Njoku and Austin Hooper. They were running a lot of 12 and 13 personnel. And the best thing they did in the passing game was throw play action screens to those guys. If I were Arthur Smith and Tom Arth and all those guys on that offensive coaching staff, I would be just watching old Kevin Stefanski tapes from those offenses, because relying on the tight ends in the passing game, the screen game, and just being dynamic and dominant on the ground, that is the best path forward for this team, no matter who's playing quarterback.
Well, I think that brings me back to the quarterback. Because I obviously kind of already gave away a little bit about what I think he needs to play like. But let's talk about why that is. Because first of all, I agree with you completely about the Browns 2020 offense. And like, especially when you look at these players and you look at the running back that they drafted, who I really like, and you look at the potential of this offensive line, all of that makes sense. My question for you is, In 2025, will Aaron Rodgers go along with this? Will he agree to this vision? Will he execute it? Will he play on time? If he plays on time, will he be averse to pressure? So and I should probably start. We can't predict the future, but I think we should probably start by talking about who Aaron Rodgers was in 2024, because there seems to be a lot of disagreement about this. Folks who said he was, he didn't deserve as much blame for the Jets season. He could still throw the ball. He can still throw the ball, right? Like there are still throws on tape from last year, end of last year. Beautiful slot fade, over the middle of the field, some seam balls, perfectly on time. Garrett Wilson, right in the numbers. My issue with him is I found, one, he doesn't have the arm talent he used to. And when I say arm talent, that's different from arm strength. He can't make the crazy out of structure stuff. And sometimes it's like he still thinks he can and he can't. Two, I actually, his accuracy was really all over the place, I thought, Robert. So what do you think about his skill set? And do you think he needs to evolve at all this year?
Evolve probably isn't the term I would use. I think the evolution for him is like becoming a more minimized part of the offense, right? Where he's not controlling everything. He's not dictating how it's going to go. Coming into last season, I remember we did on our show just kind of a bare bones look at what Aaron Rodgers was the last time he actually played football. And that was at the end of the 2022 season, right? And so we went back and watched and was like, all right, what was Aaron Rodgers for real that last year in Green Bay? And I think you could say a lot of the same things then that you can now. The arm is still pretty live. He's still capable of doing all these things. My issue with him that year with the Packers is that he just seemed completely disinterested in playing the plays. He wasn't reading stuff out. It was a lot of, I'm throwing go balls. I remember Nate Tice on our show, the phrase he used was performative deep balls. There were a lot of performative deep balls for Aaron Rodgers back then. And I think what happened with the Jets last year is similar to that, with him as an even more diminished player physically. The amount of slot fades he threw to take one-on-ones, the amount of free access throws on the outside. I just don't think he really wants to play within the structure of the offense anymore. And I think one of the answers to that is to potentially make the structure of the offense as rigid as possible and not allow him to color outside of the lines. If you're running the ball 40 times a game, if there are a ton of screens, a ton of like play action throws to the flat, just trying to make sure you're taking the pen out of his hands as often as you can, because he's not really willing to live within the offensive system. I think that's probably the route that I would take. Whether he's willing to do that, that's an entirely different conversation.
Yeah, I would say grabbing some of his stats from last year, two of the things that concerned me the most, one was the performance against the blitz, which was dismal. Defenses figured that out. And I think there's this, people blame the Jets offensive line. I'm going to plant my flag. They weren't that bad last year. There's a litany of reasons why he was bad against the blitz. We could talk about. A lot of it has to do with, frankly, what you were just saying. But and then the other thing is how bad he was intermediate. Like, that was always where Aaron Rodgers made his bread and butter. Always top 3 intermediate, 10 to 20 yards. And he was, again, bottom of the NFL last year, 30th in QBR.
He has no interest in doing it anymore. He just doesn't want to play that way anymore.
Either the ball's short or he's trying those one-on-ones. And I think if he can't do that, because what you're talking about, the Browns offense, we're doing the play action pass, we got these heavy dudes on the field. We've got the wide zone run game. We're throwing the ball into the voids created by that. He has to be a part of that, I think, for all of this to work.
Yeah, and I think the number that sticks out to me, I don't have them in front of me, but if you look at through next gen, throws in under 2.5 seconds. He has one of the highest totals in the league last year, and he was throwing them one of the highest rates. But the other guys who are doing that consistently often, they're doing it because it's beneficial to the offense.
Yeah.
Tua and the way the offense in Miami works, Joe Burrow and just how quickly he's getting rid of the ball these days. With Rodgers, he had some of the worst efficiency numbers on those throws in the league, but he's consistently doing that. And again, it's almost like just he's punting on plays so consistently. And I think you're starting to feel that. And so him just not willing to, again, play the plays and play them in the rhythm that they're supposed to happen. I just don't know if that's going to change at this point in his career, considering the last 2 full years we've seen him as a starter. He's had the same issue in both of those years.
That's such a great point about the quick game stuff, because sometimes it looks amazing. Like I would say he's still throwing slants, like he's still, and I mentioned earlier the intermittent accuracy. I think what's important to emphasize is how much of those sprays or inaccurate throws are connected to what you just described, which is anticipating pressure. And that is something that doesn't show up in the stats. It just looks like he's bad at quick game, and it show him as being pressured. So you look at the numbers and like it doesn't reflect what we're actually describing. Isn't that interesting? Like you're like, oh, okay, he's still good at quick game. And then you look at the numbers, you're like, why is he so bad at quick game? And it's because of what we were just describing, because what is quick game is not always supposed to be quick, or it's not actually helping the offense. I do want to hit DK Metcalf briefly, because even if they do play this gigantic offense as we hope, well, DK is also gigantic. Interesting pairing, right? Like, so I'll just share my thoughts, and we've talked about this, and you can tell me what you think, because I have been asked about this. And first of all, if you're in fantasy, I would absolutely buy DK, because who the hell else is getting the football in this offense?
Oh, you say that until Johnny Smith gets 130 targets this year.
Arthur Smith in the corner rubbing his hands together. Okay, so DK Metcalf is good at some of the things that Aaron Rodgers likes to do now. We talked about the go balls, slants, hitches. That's a very not insubstantial portion of DK Metcalf's route tree. And DK has the ability to win those one-on-ones if Rodgers trusts him on some of it. The slants. I'm thinking of the slants in particular. He's really good at using his big body to box out DBs and get you a first down. Other aspects of it, crossers, work in the middle of the field. That's just not what Rodgers really does these days. And of course, the other piece of this is the nuance and timing aspect of it, which is, if you had to give one ding on DK, that would be it for me. There's just a lot of, moments where Geno Smith clearly thought he was going to be one place. He wasn't. Sometimes high leverage situations. So
yeah, that's a problem.
Yeah, that's a problem. So I guess what I'm saying is there's good and there's bad in this relationship. It does not strike me as a perfect match, but there is potential for it to at least be productive.
I think so too. I think the slants is the first place my mind would go, because he'll still rip a slant, and obviously DK is really good on those, like working off of that sort of route stem. I think that the go ball part of it, if they are like actual deep balls where they're trying to push the ball down the field, that part of it works. Any sort of back shoulder game with DK Metcalf just makes my skin start to crawl. And so I think that's the issue that you run into, is that, when he's been at his best, Rodgers, with these true number one receivers within the offense, they've had such a connection. There's just been such an ease of communication and reading body language. And there just is a really deep understanding of how all the different versions of this play can play out. And I just think DK Metcalf has struggled to become that sort of player where you can rely on him that way. So I can imagine this being maybe a little bit more volatile than the Steelers probably want it to be, considering how much they're banking on each of these guys.
Well, the final piece of this is the run game and also the offensive line, which, again, we are in lockstep here. This has to be, they have to take a leap forward in this regard. I think it's possible. I talked about the construction of the offensive line earlier. Broderick Jones has played. He's been, used in different ways. I think the hope is with Fautanu coming back after he was injured last season. They've solidified the tackle positions. The interior is fantastic. And then they drafted a back in Caleb Johnson, who's like a perfect, literally an Arthur Smith's ideal running back, quite frankly. Am I being Pollyanna-ish in thinking this could work, or do you feel like there's an optimistic case for it?
I think it's so tempting to push yourself there because it needs to work. And so that's why it's so easy and so tempting to imagine it, because like it's almost a non-starter for this offense if the line doesn't come together. But I still think there are enough question marks and enough uncertainty that I'm not betting money on it. You have Fautanu coming in as essentially a first-year starter, right? He played one game last year before getting hurt. And then you have Broderick Jones now flipping back over to the left side after going back and forth over the last few years. And, he had stretches at the end of last season where he was a little bit better, but this is someone who has struggled with confidence, with the mental side of things. And so now you're switching positions for him again. And so I just think that there are enough question marks where I'm not willing to say I'm full steam ahead, like wheels up, this is going to work. But if it doesn't, then I'm not sure any of the rest of this matters, because it is the most important thing for this offensive line, or this offense period.
25th in both success rate and EPA last year. I would say they have to be top 12 for me to feel like this offense can be better than it was
At
last
least.
season. And that's quite a leap. Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I really like Caleb Johnson, so I think maybe that's my favorite piece of this puzzle. All right, defense. Okay, so this is a little bit hard to talk about because I am not quite sure what role I expect Jalen Ramsey to play. So let's start there. So Minka's out. So at the moment, the front is awesome. We'll talk about the front, assuming TJ Watt is a Steeler, which I don't know why they would do any of this if he's not a Steeler. So I just don't even, whatever. But let's talk about the secondary. Right now, your cornerback room is Joey Porter Jr., Darius Slay, Jalen Ramsey, and Beanie Bishop, who's their nickel, who's kind of a hilarious player. And with Minka gone, you're starting safeties, Juan Thornhill, Deshaun Elliott. So Ramsey is an interesting player because he played primarily outside last year in Miami, but at various points in his career, he has played nickel. He was the star position with the LA Rams, and he has expressed that he is interested in making the move to safety at some point, which the first time I heard him say it must have been like a year ago. I was like, yeah, that makes sense. He's one of the best tackling corners in the NFL. He is extremely strong, and you could see that. He's also really smart, and I feel like he's got a really good awareness of his capabilities. And so how would you play Jalen Ramsey with this group?
In this defense, I think I'd play him in the nickel, because I think you can get by with Juan Thornhill and Deshaun Elliott, even if you don't feel great about it. And I remember, we've discussed this a little bit in the past. Like, I just feel like the types of linebackers they have, having one more second level spine of the defense defender you feel good about in coverage is important for this team, because that's not who their linebackers are. And when you've seen Patrick Queen be at his best, it's been paired with a guy like Roquan Smith. That's not what Peyton Wilson is. Like, they've got two run and hit linebackers who aren't at their best moving backward. And so I think adding a strong nickel to that equation, it helps things. And so the idea that this collection of guys with Joey Porter Jr. and Darius Slay outside, Jalen Ramsey in the nickel, and Deshaun Elliott and Juan Thornhill at safety is a better collection of players for you right now than Joey Porter Jr., Darius Slay, Beanie Bishop, Minka Fitzpatrick, and Deshaun Elliott. I get that if you're the Steelers. I don't know how appreciable the difference is, but them looking at both of those collections of players and saying, we're better with the Jalen Ramsey version, I get landing there.
I think it makes sense too. I'm not saying, it's this like massive upgrade, but I think when you think about what they want to do on defense and who they need to stop, which I'll get to in a second, this makes more sense. This was a defense that played amongst their first in single high last season, and Minka was not great in that role, and he hasn't been for a couple of years. Now he's going to go to Miami, which is a very different defense. We'll get to that. Also makes sense for Miami, by the way. So there's that piece of it, and then the other piece is this defense has a massive Baltimore Ravens problem. Let's, I sent you this split, but like their run defense when they didn't play the Ravens was one of the best in the NFL, and then when they played the Ravens, they allowed 6 yards per carry and 0.11 EPA per play on the ground. Now every defense has a Ravens problem, but they're in their division, right? And I'm not saying Jalen Ramsey solves that. I think the biggest issue is linebacker, which I'll get to shortly. But your biggest op is a team that is unbelievably good to run the ball and runs the offense through the tight ends. Bringing in a super physical nickel makes sense in that context. I'm not saying this is entirely about the Baltimore Ravens. I'm just saying when you think about this team, what they want to do in defense, who they have to stop, it makes more sense to me.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also think that part of the problem living in that single high world with the safeties that they had is that dropping Minka back there and just having him be your post safety, you're almost defanging what makes him great. And I think that's part of the reason that you can justify this is that Minka Fitzpatrick at his best is a really, really good player. He's 2 years younger than Jalen Ramsey, but based on the construction of the defense and the way that they were using him, they weren't getting Minka Fitzpatrick at his best. And so I think bringing in Jalen Ramsey, having him be closer to the ball, having him play a role that we've seen him be great at in the past. Again, that's part of the reason I think that you can get yourself there for why this is worth it for the Steelers, even if it's accelerating their timeline even more. This is already one of the oldest defenses in the league last year. And all they have done this offseason, their two biggest moves on defense this offseason, we're signing a 34-year-old corner and upgrade and getting 2 years older with your best spine of the defense coverage player.
Well, that brings me back to TJ Watt. I don't want to take this seriously. Like he's, I guess,
How could you justify anything else you've done if TJ Watt's not on the roster?
That's why I barely want to even acknowledge the idea that, teams are calling. Of course, teams want to trade for TJ Watt. There's zero. The Steelers moving on from TJ Watt makes zero sense. I'm not saying, I'm not a reporter. Maybe it'll happen, but it just makes zero sense. So I'm not going to acknowledge it at all. I'm just pretending it's not even a thing. The pass rush is obviously still incredible. You had Derek Harmon, who is a prospect you and I both love, arguably the best pass rushing defensive tackle in football last year, had the most pressures. They're deep. He gets to learn next to Cam Hayward, which is awesome. No concerns there. I'll just say one more thing about the Steelers defense, and this kind of connects back to the Ravens thing. I do think the linebacking group needs to take a step forward for this to be an elite unit, and two, to compete in their own division next year.
It's just a very undisciplined group. Like when you watch them, I think that's the reason they have a Ravens problem, is that they're like a cat chasing a laser pointer every single time there's any sort of movement. And you go back and you watch those Ravens games and they're just toying with them. Todd Monken is over the course of those games. And so that extends to discipline and run defense. And again, those guys just aren't really comfortable moving backwards and playing in coverage. They're good athletes. They're explosive athletes. But I think you saw how easy it is to manipulate that group and just how little stability they have on the second level of that defense. And that's hopefully where Jalen Ramsey comes in at least a little bit.
11th in success rate versus offenses when they didn't use motion, 28th when they did motion at the snap. And to your point, it's really glaring when you watch them. And that's not just a Ravens problem. They're in a conference with the Chiefs, the Bills. You saw this show up time again. So coaching, I think, is going to be massive here. Let's just wrap this up before we move on to the next team. And I have one question for you about the Steelers. Should they be going all in? Like, does this make sense to you, the approach that they've taken over the last week?
Here's the reason I don't have an active problem with it. The issue that I have when some teams are pushing all of the chips in is that it leverages your future in a way that becomes a problem. You start taking away from who you can be the next year or the year after that. Doing that. Yeah, exactly. I mean, when it's teams trading away real draft capital, the draft capital moved in these deals is a 5th and a 7th swap in 2027. I can't get worked up over that. I just can't get there. Everything else has set them up to pivot pretty smoothly into next offseason if this falls short. They have $86 million in cap space right now without a TJ Watt extension on the books. The only real thing they're doing to leverage their financial future is they'll probably prorate that Jalen Ramsey option bonus over like 4 or 5 years, but you'll barely notice that. And so them knowing we have an aging core, we might as well do a couple small things here on the margins to try to get the most out of this year, knowing that we're going to turn the page next year. So with that in mind, and this idea of, I assume, right or wrong, that they'll be in a position to trade up and try to draft a quarterback next year no matter what. That's why it's harder for me to get super worked up over some of the moves they've made here. This feels like a 2025 thing. Let's see what sort of juice we can squeeze out of this, knowing we're going to have to go in a different direction next year. If they use this as a justification to rationalize, well, what if we get a slight uptick from another veteran quarterback for one more year in 2026? That's the potential downside to this. But for the most part, I think that they've insulated themselves enough to be okay next year, no matter how this goes.
Yeah, generally in agreement. I think, anyone who's listening to this can tell we actually don't mind. Like, we both like the Jonnu Smith addition. I think we both think there's a case for Jalen Ramsey as well. It's not like a massive needle mover for me in this particular division. And as far as going up to get quarterback, well, they're going to have a hard time competing with the team we're going to talk about next in the draft next year. Let's do the Cleveland Browns next. Like I said, the Ravens fans, I've given you so much Ravens talk that honestly, we should probably do the least on the Ravens just based on the amount of time I've already spent talking about them. You've not gotten much Browns talk. this is a perilous time to be talking about the Browns offense because we have no idea who is playing quarterback for the Cleveland Browns. Of course, it starts there. It is going to be breathlessly followed all summer come July. At the moment, you got Kenny Pickett, Joe Flacco. I probably should start. Joe Flacco, Kenny Pickett, Dylan Gabriel, Shedeur Sanders. I don't know if we should start with that. I mean, it's so hard to even talk about. Like, I think that the Browns would argue that the offense is going to be pretty similar regardless of who's playing. I think is interesting, right? Because with a lot of these quarterbacks, we just talked about like Aaron Rodgers. Like, what should Aaron Rodgers Steelers offense be like? I don't want to say the Browns are quarterback agnostic because God knows that they have changed their offense over the last few years depending on who is playing. But I do think that everything else they've done this offseason and in the draft suggests they have a pretty specific vision for what they want the offense, Kevin Stefanski's offense, to look like. And this isn't necessarily going to determine who's going to get the job or who's going to play the most starts for them. But I almost feel like that vision for the offense is more important than who ends up playing more quarterback for them. Does that make sense?
Yes, because you asked me what the perfect vision for the Steelers offense was, and I said it was Aaron Rodgers throwing the ball 22 times a game. The perfect vision for the Browns offense is whoever plays quarterback throwing the ball like 14 times a game. Remember those first two games last year for the Saints with Derek Carr and Clint Kubiak? And how Derek Carr in those two games combined had like 7 or 8 drop back non-play action pass attempts? That is the vision for what the 2025 Cleveland Browns should look like, no matter who ends up playing quarterback for them.
I read an interview with Joel Petonio, I think in The Athletic, where he like talked about the run game. Because I read a lot of Browns coverage to try to see if like there was any insight into the quarterback situation, any little glimmers of little clues perhaps. And I didn't learn anything. However, he talked at length in this interview about the run game and what he thought it would look like and how they were going to go back to more of the like Stefanski ball control, run the ball, play action, wide zone with a little bit of power mixed in. He was like, this feels like 2020-21 with outside zone and power mixed in. This is Joel Petonio talking. And we will win with ball control. So, always good when you're, you got that pretty strong idea, I suppose, of what it will look like. But, a lot of that has to do with the players they have. It's an interesting offensive line, interesting insofar as like it's guys who have been in the building who have been coming off of either bad years or injuries in a lot of ways. It's a pretty lackluster receiver group. Judy, Cedric Tillman, Deontay Johnson, who recently informed the world that he opted not to play in a Baltimore Ravens game because it was 41 degrees. Honestly, don't judge him for that. That's how David and Joe.
I'm not sure you would do well in 41 degrees at this point in your life.
Harold Fannin, who was a very interesting draft pick at tight end, who's more of like a H-back type. And then they drafted a bunch of running backs. So in addition to Jerome Ford and they have Quinshon Judkins and Dylan Sampson. So like, we know what this offense wants to look like. Of the 4 quarterbacks I mentioned, is there anyone you think is a good fit for that offense?
I mean, I think that we've seen Joe Flacco play in some version of that offense.
Yeah.
When you go back and you think about the 2023 Browns and what they look like with Joe Flacco compared to what they look like with Deshaun Watson, I do think there's a path for it there. I think the Browns are walking into this hoping that one of the rookies makes it close enough as part of this competition that they can give that guy a shot, right? Like, I think the ideal version for the Browns quarterback room was always going to be something like the 2012 Seahawks looked like, where you bring in a free agent of some kind. You have a third guy in there, and then you draft somebody in the middle rounds and you hope that guy wins the job because obviously that's going to give you the highest upside over like a multi-year period. So the idea, I think, always was to go into the draft, find a guy in the second or third round, put him in a room with Kenny Pickett and Joe Flacco, have that guy win the job if it was even close. They've complicated that by adding 2 rookies, neither of whom is probably going to get enough reps to forcibly win the job in the way that they would if there was only one guy. So there's just so many layers of complication here. I think I want to see one of the rookies do it just because I find it much, much more interesting than trying to watch 47-year-old Joe Flacco limp to the finish line with this sporting cast.
Yeah, I don't want to watch that either. Just no, and I don't want to watch Kenny Pickett. Sorry. So for me, if I'm a Browns fan, I'm rooting for one of the two young guys to get most. I think likely Joe Flacco probably starts the season, but at some point they make a transition after like a interception game or something. About those two young quarterbacks and sort of whether they fit in the type of offense we've been talking about a little bit. You mentioned the 2012 Seahawks. I feel like I've seen Dylan Gabriel comp to Russell Wilson a little bit. I don't know if it was by the Browns or the media. So I actually liked Dylan Gabriel. I ended up watching him. Obviously, we all did because he was Oregon a fair amount. I think there's a perfectly realistic path to where he actually can. I wouldn't say start in the NFL, but I thought of him as like maybe in a good situation he could produce, and he could certainly be like a high end back. That's how I felt about him. He is, I think, pretty accurate. I think he is smart. I think he has one similarity to Russ, which is that despite being very small, he is willing to throw over the middle of the field. Oh, sorry, not similar to Russ. I meant to say difference. But the other difference, though, is that Russ was a significantly better athlete in 2012 and had a much better arm, in my belief. I don't think Gabriel's arm is bad. I actually think it's fine. But Russ's athleticism and his arm strength for years allowed him to compensate for the problems created by his height. And I just don't see that with Gabriel, personally.
It's a worthwhile thing to bring up. When they looked at Dylan Gabriel, the way that I understand it is that they thought the height was the only knock against him. And they were hoping that because of that, if that was the only thing, if it was that he was a little bit short, is he going to go later than he should because teams are going to be scared off by that? And so I think there's a lot of fans of Dylan Gabriel's in that building. And I think that if in any other scenario, I think that we would just be talking about Dylan Gabriel winning that job because he has a clear path to it. The Shedeur Sanders thing just really complicates all of this. And this is sort of my problem with the Browns every once in a while, is that when you look at what they do, I think that it's so based on percentages and odds and like, all right.
Oh, let's just collect quarterbacks and
that's exactly right. And I think the Kenny Pickett part of this is similar to that, where you're looking at Kenny Pickett and you say, all right, think about where Kenny Pickett has been his entire life. He was with Matt Canada in Pittsburgh, he had absolutely no shot. He goes to Philly for a year, doesn't really play. He's never been in even a decent situation for more than a handful or two stopgap starts. Like, we can get more out of a first round pick than he's shown over the course of his career. That's fine. But if these incremental wins on these small bets, I think sometimes you lose sight of the bigger picture. And I think that's kind of what has happened with this whole thing, where individually I can support all of the decisions they made to add these people to the room. But when you look at the room overall, I think it becomes a barrier to figuring out the quarterback situation in a positive way.
The other thing that complicates is Gabriel and Sanders, I think, like, both make sense in the offense. So I guess that complicates it. Pardon me. It complicates the quarterback competition aspect of it. But I think, like, you could argue both of them, this is the right kind of offense for both of those quarterbacks, in my opinion. And they have some similar traits. Like, they're both accurate. I pulled this because I was curious. Gabriel and Sanders had the second and fifth highest catchable ball rate in football. Now, that's skewed a little bit by screens and wide open guys and all of that, but it's what it looked like. Like, they're both really accurate. I think they're both tough. I think that they, I based on what we saw in college, you could see either of them winning, I guess is what I'm saying. The situation, though, itself, I think, is something that we probably have to discuss, because like you said, the goal here is obviously to be a run-first team, like Joel Bitonio said. They're going to, use a lot of two tight end sets. I don't know how Fannin is going to be deployed. It'll be interesting. But it's a pretty shaky group of pass catchers. Judy, to his credit, in the second half of last season, actually ranked third league-wide in yards per game, despite not like having a crazy dominant target share. You remember some of the games with Jameis where he just like went crazy. But Tillman, Deontay Johnson, I don't know. I really don't know. who they like if they're in 12 personnel, who are they? I really don't know how the rest of the group shakes out.
I don't mind the combination of Cedric Tillman and Jerry Jeudy because I do think they have complementary skill sets, right?
That's
If
true.
Jerry Jeudy is going to be your like vertical kind of slot player where, you know, you can use him as that vertical stretch guy, Tillman is a nice big bodied X receiver who I do think is viable over the middle of the field. The last thing I'll say about the quarterback part of this is that I think I agree with you when it comes to the skill sets. I think that Dylan Gabriel is going to have a pretty big lead going into this on the mental side of things. And I think that that could go a long way, even if when you think about how they throw the ball, accuracy being a strength, they're similar sorts of players. I do think Dylan Gabriel has a little bit of a leg up when it comes to how mature he is in his understanding of football, the decision making, all of that. And so I think if it comes down to it, that's why I would give him a little bit of the edge. And if he can just play point guard within this offense, if it's going to be play action heavy, and the other part of it is the screen game. When you think
Yeah.
back to when this offense was at its best, and that's kind of what I'm so fascinated in with Harold Fannin as being part of
Yeah.
this. Like him with the ball in his hands, he's such a weird, funky player. And I think we've seen Kevin Stefanski be really successful at deploying these kind of weird, funky tight ends as after the catch players. So I think there's a world where the passing game is kind of strange and they manufacture stuff out of it and it does work. To me, it comes down to the offensive line and whether they can have a bounce back year. Then you look at what they've tried to do, especially last year. You know, even 2 years ago, it's a spread offense. It's a spread offense the entire time with Deshaun Watson, and they're trying to live in these two different worlds where they're trying to meld the Bill Callahan, Kevin Stefanski world with the Deshaun Watson world, and it never worked. And then last year, they move on from Bill, and they go even well. Bill moves on from them, and they go even further into the Deshaun Watson world, where you have a run game that's a lot more mid zone. And then if you look at the construction of the coaching staff, they actually brought over the assistant offensive line coach from the Eagles to be the assistant offensive line coach last year. And so you have a lot of this like mid zone gun run game. And that's never what the Browns were at their best. Like Joe Bitonio said, it was all outside zone and power stuff. And so I think that there's a version of this team where the offensive line performs significantly better this year because you're putting them back in a scheme where they're comfortable, let alone how comfortable the play caller is with it. And so if that can be the engine of it, and then you can do the play action screen game stuff off of it, I do think the receivers are good enough to survive in an offense like that. But if you don't have the line in the run game, then none of the rest of this really matters.
I mean, what you're describing really does actually sound a lot like the 2012 Seahawks. The Russell Wilson rookie season. Like while I know I expect some skepticism about the Gabriel Wilson comp. I think the vision, like earmarking that season and the environment and Russ was able to flourish, and the way they approached the run game and the what you saw from the offensive line. Russ was under center. Like I think you could see that, like that. You could establish like the building blocks of something, even if maybe you decide to move on to a different quarterback next year. But it all falls apart if this offensive line plays like they did last year. And obviously they were dealing with injuries, but there were players who did play last year who were not good when they played. So it's just, you not only have to see guys get healthy, you have to see some players return a little bit more to how they looked a couple of years ago. And that's a pretty dicey bet. I like both these backs a lot. I'll finish by saying that. Judkins, Sampson, I think were both really fun picks that have they're very complementary in terms of like very, very different skill sets that they use on different concepts and different situations. And yeah, the Fannin thing, I'm excited to watch. Tommy Reese, who's their offensive coordinator, was the tight ends coach last year.
Mm-hmm.
I have to think that I wouldn't be surprised if Fannin is like a slightly bigger part of the offense maybe than people expect.
He might have to be, I mean, based on everything else that they have.
Because of the other receivers. The defense, I'm just going to ask you the question that I posed to Dominique when we debated whether or not to put this defense in the top 10. Aside from Jeremiah Owusu-Koroma missing a lot of the season last year, what went wrong? Because this defense went from being one of the best defenses in football to one of the worst statistically. How that breaks down the things they were bad at, we can get into. But just start off, because I think we have to talk about what went wrong to talk about whether or not it can go right.
There are two things I would start with. One, I think, and this is going to be like, I'm starting to build this point, and I'm starting to build this as like one of my hobby horses that I'm going to hit on a lot this offseason. I've come to a conclusion that pressure numbers are fake and we should not believe them. And part of the reason I've come to this conclusion is watching the 2024 Cleveland Browns and then looking at the pressure numbers for the 2024 Cleveland Browns. They led the league in pressure rate according to Next Gen Stats. And when you watch this team play, they were not affecting the pocket more than any other pass rush in the NFL. And so I think that is the number one starting point. When you look at what this team was in 2023 and that wave of guys coming at you, that just wasn't the case last year. Even when Zadarius Smith was there, he was not the same player. And so them not being able to take over games up front, and I think you're starting to feel that, I think that's a big part of it. But I think this is another really good case of how volatile coverage is and how not sticky it is from season to season. You're going to have those years like they had in 2023 where those guys pitched a shutout for like 17 games. They were so good in man coverage. And I think the number that really kind of points to this, in 2023, when they were the best defense in the league, they had a 61% defensive success rate without pressure. That's crazy. Like league average is 50. And so the pressure and the front was good, but the coverage was phenomenal even when they weren't getting pressure. Last year, that number was 51%. So they dropped 10 percentage points, and 51% is essentially league average. And that's about what you would expect. So I think when you combine the lack of teeth up front and them not being able to dictate games that way, and the coverage unit going back to human levels of pass coverage, combining those two things, plus the worst conversion success rate on offensive downs in the NFL and what that does to a defense, those are kind of the ingredients in the stew here that I think get us where we were with the 2024 Browns defense.
That's where Dominique ended up putting the top 10. And I put them just outside. And my final straw was like, I don't think the offense is going to be good. So I feel like they're just going to be in the same psychological torture chamber that they were all of last year.
They can't be as bad as they were last year.
Yeah, no, if they're even decent at running the ball and avoiding 3-and-outs as much, it helps. Back to the pressure thing, though. I'm so glad you brought that up because when I was doing the top 10 defenses pod, I was looking at a lot of the pressure numbers and the pass rush win numbers and trying to figure out like what felt real and what didn't. And where I landed with the Browns, I didn't get into this, was I want to like change the way I look at pressure numbers too in stats, because I think my feeling about them was they were the perfect example of you can't just have one player affecting the quarterback.
Yes.
And that one player, obviously Myles Garrett, is going to lift the boat of all your pass rush because he's going to win. Myles Garrett is going to win on a hilarious number of snaps. So as a team, you're all going to get credit for Myles Garrett winning, but nobody else is winning. So against, certain offensive lines, certain quarterbacks, you're not able to affect the quarterback as much if you have only one player who wins over and over and over. And I don't know, I have to think through this more, how to like statistically accommodate that. But I do think the Cincinnati Bengals are a great example of that as well, of course, who we're going to talk about. But I do think that was a huge part of it. Just nobody was getting pressure outside of Myles Garrett. Nobody on this defense. So I'm looking at the defense right now, and I'm looking at the depth chart, and my question for you is, okay, who else is getting pressured this year? Because is it Mason Graham? Who's going to be 4-3? Yeah, right? I mean, you took him very high in the draft.
It better be Mason Graham, considering where they took him in that draft and the fact that they did not trade down again when they probably could have. So I think that it better be Mason Graham. And I think the pressure stuff it's fascinating because I think we're going to come to a point where we want to use as much data as we can. But I think where this data comes from and thinking about that is really important. Like pressure numbers are based on tracking data. And so if you're a defensive end and if you win on the high side as a rusher and the quarterback steps up in the pocket, but you really didn't affect the play at all, that's a pressure. And so I think we're going to see a lot of that and the layers to it. So there's just so many things to consider there, but I agree with you that no one else on that defense is mostly getting pressure. Well, I think that the offense playing better is something that is important though. Like if you look at the numbers from last year, they were dead last in drive success rate, drive conversion rate per True Media, which is like the percentage of your drives that end in the first down. The gap between them and the Raiders at 31 was bigger than the gap between the Raiders and the Broncos at 19. And the other number to me that's just like, it's impossible to wrap your mind around. Last year, the Browns lost 162 combined EPA on turnovers and sacks. That was the second most for any team in a season since 2000. The only team that was worse than them was the Andrew Walter Raiders. And so even if you're just like normal bad, and you have all those players back on defense, I
Yeah.
still think that the defense can be pretty good.
It's a really important point with the Browns is how much the defense was affected by the offense. And yeah, I think if they can even just be normal bad, like you said, if they can run the ball well, I really think that that's going to be that's going to impact the defense in a massive way. By the way, while we were talking, I just pulled this up. 2023, so Myles Garrett had 89 pressures. Shocker, it's a zillion. Darius Smith that year had 61, which
He was
is
awesome.
a lot. And last year, no other Browns edge had over 30. The highest was Isaiah McGuire with 29. So, yeah, I
think Z had 27 in the games he played with the Browns. So if you
Yeah,
extrapolate that over the course of a whole season, he would end up with like 50 something. But that's still not a lot. And especially when you don't have any complimentary interior rushers. Like Dalvin Tomlinson was their best one last year, and he definitely is on the back half of his career.
The other thing they need to happen is Martin Emerson has to find some middle ground between who he was a couple years ago and who he was last year. He doesn't have to be awesome, but he cannot play the way he did last season. It's just simple, I think.
It speaks to how volatile coverage is. Like it's just so hard to rely on that. And you have these years where it all clicks. And if you don't take advantage of those years, you're almost inevitably going to take a step backward. And that's just one of those things when it comes to defensive regression that we probably don't talk about enough because there's really no explanation for it.
Yeah.
Like I think we want these things to be prescriptive. Yes. Yeah. Where it's like, all right, well, why didn't this guy play as well in a year B compared to year A at corner? And there isn't really a causal element to it. Sometimes just he didn't play as well. And that's not a satisfactory answer to fans, but that just is how corner goes sometimes.
I also think that with corners, offenses are really good at studying their weaknesses and breaking them down. I think of Sauce
Maybe that's it. It's a great point.
Perfect example of that as a player where he was at a rookie. He just looked like the best corner in the NFL. And I think offenses figured out how to attack him. Obviously running at him was a big thing, but yeah, it's a tough position to play and be really good. Dizzle Ward's still amazing. I still think Greg Newsome, who missed a few games, is really good. So I do think they'll bounce back. I do. Like I said, I just had them just outside the top 10. But a lot of it is contingent on the offense not being historically bad. All right, let's take a quick break and come back and talk about another defense that was very bad last year and whether or not they can be slightly below average in the Cincinnati Bengals. We'll also talk about their offense. All right, so I've been starting with offenses, but I feel like with the Bengals, we have to start with the defense because there's not actually that much to talk about the offense. We can get in the offense, there's some fun wrinkles there, but it's the Bengals offense. We know it. We kind of know what it's going to look like. We know it. The defense obviously was the problem last year. 27th in run DVOA, 26th versus the pass. Interestingly, not as bad in EPA per play because they had some interceptions, but they were 29th in success rate. They were bad at everything. We didn't even need to get into it. They were bad at tackling. They were bad against the run. They were bad at getting pressure outside of Trey Hendrickson. All of that. So the biggest change is there's a few interesting personnel changes. Jermaine Pratt is gone. A rookie linebacker, Demetrius Knight, is in. Let's pretend Trey Hendrickson is playing because if he's not, it's not even worth having a conversation. They're going to be freaking awful. Sorry. I mean, right? Can we just start there? We're pretending he's playing. Okay.
Is he the most important defensive player in the league?
Yes.
When you think about...
Yes. 100%. Yes. Myles Garrett's actually not that far behind as I looked at that pass rushing group, but at least Myles Garrett has like good players behind him and at some positions. Yes, Trey Hendrickson, he has so much leverage. Like what a great case study in how much leverage a single player can have.
He has leverage in a normal situation.
Yeah, right.
In a normal situation, if you were by far the best player on your defense and your team, and I made a mistake in saying this publicly a few weeks ago where I was talking about this team like wanting to win a Super Bowl and why that makes the Shamar Stewart thing so stupid. And people were like, are you sure they want to win a Super Bowl? So I'm amending this a little bit. When you have a team and an offense that is capable of winning a Super Bowl, you would think that a player in Trey Hendrickson's situation would have some leverage, but I don't think you can ascribe normal logic and motivation and thinking to the way that the Cincinnati Bengals operate, unfortunately.
I don't even want to try to break it down. I've avoided the Shamar Stewart thing. I'm like, just get back to me in a few weeks. I don't even want to get into it. But let's talk about this defense as though he is playing, because if he is not, it is, code red, like just freaking abandon all hope. So the biggest change is the defense coordinator, and that's actually where I want to start with you, because I find it really interesting. So they fired Lou Anarumo, they hired Al Golden from college. Dominique and I, when we were talking about some of the success, the best defenses in football, and then the success of guys like Jesse Minter and Jeff Hafley in Green Bay. Lately, college DCs are doing really well in the NFL. So I think, and God, Notre Dame's defense was fun to watch. I don't know how much of them you watched in your draft process.
Very, very little.
Okay. Really fun to watch. Really different from what we're going to see in the NFL. They played an preposterous amount of man coverage. Let's start there. Levels that would be absolutely insane for an NFL, because they were incredibly talented. You had multiple guys get drafted. This is not surprising. They've been really, really good for years. But also very creative in terms of some of the simulated pressures that he was calling, and some of the disguise he was using on the back end. So I guess my question for you is, how hopeful are you, if you're a Bengals fan, that this could actually be an upgrade over Anarumo?
What they've been trying to sell this entire offseason, and the way that it can be an upgrade, isn't, I think, about schematics. I don't think it's about the quality of defensive play caller even. I think the frustration with Lou, and I think some of this is the messaging that has to happen after you fire a guy who's been really successful for you. It's that he has not been able to develop the young players that they have drafted. And that is the Lou Anarumo problem. I think that's throwing Lou under the bus a little bit for the drafting that has happened. But I do kind of know where they're coming from in this way. When you look at what that defense was at its best, and I remember talking to Lou about this kind of that year after, I want to say it was a year after they really gave Mahomes a bunch of trouble in the AFC Championship game, and they were doing all that funky simulated pressure stuff, and just talking to him about how flexible they could be on the back end and the ways that he would teach some of this stuff. And I think he didn't say it directly, but Al Golden was talking about it this offseason, how he didn't want to be putting stuff in that he was drawing up on a Thursday night. And I kind of think that was an indirect shot at how Lou used to operate. But I think there was a lot of, all right, we're operating at this master's level on defense, where I have all these smart veteran players, and that's how we're going to thrive and be successful. And when they flipped that, and when they started injecting the defense with more youth because they had to get a little bit cheaper on that side, I think they failed to carry over that same sort of model. And so if you can simplify things a little bit and just make things easier on some of those young players and bring them along at the correct pace, and you can get better play from McKinley Jackson and BJ Hill and Dax Hill and all of those young pieces on defense, that's the argument for me. Whether I'm buying it, that's a different question. I don't know if I am. I think that's one of those things that sounds really, really good in April, May, and June. Yeah. And we'll see how it actually looks on the field, because I think Lou Anarumo is pretty good at his job.
I think if you're a Bengals fan, the optimistic case here is twofold. It's what you're saying, which is we brought in a college coach who's ostensibly, I don't even think it's about necessarily simplifying the defense, because I don't think last year they were they simplified it last year, but I think it is teaching and developing. So you bring in a guy
teaching progression, I think, is a big part of it. Are you layering it in the correct way for young players? And Al Golden has talked about that this offseason.
Like I said, you look at guys like Hafley. I mean, how good were those Packers rookies on defense? You look at the Chargers.
And that wasn't a simple defense. They were doing a lot of funky stuff in Green Bay.
But I think you can look at a lot of the coaches that have come from college in recent years, and they do have a really good track record with younger defenders. So there's hope there. The other thing I would say you can not hang your hat on, but hope for, is that some of the players in the secondary have flashed. I think that when I look at this group, Cam Taylor-Britt, Dax Hill, TJ Turner, Jordan Battle, it's a very young secondary. They have had moments where in some cases, like Dax Hill, and I would argue Taylor-Britt, more than moments, stretches where you were like, okay, there's something here. This is not these are not busts, and in the traditional sense where they came in, they never looked good. Miles Murphy, and then we don't have to talk about. But the secondary has shown you at least there's something to work with. So whether or not this is why I started by asking about the coach, because I just feel like he is so important to whether or not they can go from being the 27th to 28th defense to the 19th through 21st defense.
That's usually how it happens, is that you bring in the right coordinator and it hits. And Dax Hill, I mean, it's kind of tragic is probably overstating it. It's unfortunate that we got 5 games of him at corner last year. He looked really good when they finally gave him a more solidified role, and then he gets hurt immediately. So I do think it's there. I just worry about the players up front and whether they're going to be good enough. The Shamar Stewart thing, if no matter who it was, doing this with a guy that you drafted in the first round is dumb on its own. The guy who is the rawest player that you could have drafted in the first round, not getting every single rep in practice in a season where, again, you justifiably want to win your division and want to win playoff games is very frustrating. But you even like you draft Demetrius Knight in the second round. In theory, maybe he's an upgrade over Jermaine Pratt and what he was last year. Who knows? And they really added nothing up front other than Shamar Stewart in the draft. Like the fact that their big splash in the front 7 in free agency was TJ Slayton, who I actually like for what they're
He
asking
was
him to do.
awesome in the playoff game against.
I like TJ Slayton. I've always liked TJ Slayton. Like 3 years ago when he was a rookie, I was like, oh man, that guy has flashes. Like he can't do a lot for you, but what he can do, he's good at. And so that as like one piece of a broader defensive personnel makeover, I think I would have enjoyed. That was the thing that they did in free agency. And so I can totally understand buying into this idea. The young players are going to be better with a coach who is better at coaching young players. I just wish there would have been like a tad more urgency in making sure the players were just better across the board as we headed into next season.
Yeah, I know, because they would say, "Well, we had to pay, Jamar and T, or we're about to talk
No,
about." But like, there were lower. It's not like we're asking them to go sign Milton Williams, or Josh Sweat. There were other players who are like competent NFL play. Jadeveon Clowney's still out there, by the way. This pass rush is very alarming. The defensive line. I will say, Jermaine Pratt last year looked like he was playing in like rain boots at times. So I feel like Knight will probably be an upgrade, but we'll see. Okay, let's get to the offense. So, they were, I think I had them 4th and Ben had them 3rd in our offensive projections. We were very, very high on them. This is an offense that has been slow to start, but is finally going into the season with a normal offseason where the main guys are all healthy. Nobody's holding out. That should help their slow starts. I kind of joked about how like there's not much to talk about because it's like going to look pretty similar to how it has. But I actually, that was a little bit flip because it actually has. There's been some tweaks since over the last couple of years. Is there anything they did last season? Dan Pitcher being the play caller now after Callahan left. Is there anything they did that you kind of want to see more of this year, or anything that you found like kind of interesting about the Bengals offense that we might be excited about?
I just like how blurred the roles are getting among the pass catchers, right? Like it's become, it was a team that when they were a little bit more static offensively, those guys were locked into very defined roles. And I think T still is a little bit like that. Like T Higgins is what T Higgins is. But if you look at the amount of snaps, the amount of targets, the amount of usage that like a Jamar Chase is getting from the slot compared to what it would have looked like a couple years ago, and even like what Mike Gesicki is for them, like he's such a weird player in this offense. And I think he was like 18th last year in just targets out of the slot, period, among all players in the NFL. So he was essentially just a big slot receiver for them. And it's always funny. Like I do this training camp tour every year where I go visit like 22 teams almost every year. And I just love talking to coaches about, all right, like what is your plan? What do you want the offense to look like? And hearing Dan Pitcher articulate what they were thinking about with that third receiver spot and how between Yoshivas and Gesicki, it was just going to be a rotating cast that made the offense feel different depending on who that guy was. Again, that's something that sounds awesome on August 3rd. And you're like, how is this actually going to go? And that actually is how it went. Like, depending on who was in that spot, the offense felt different. They could do different things with them. And so those layers to just how diverse the passing game feels and how diverse the application of these players feels compared to how solidified that 11 personnel was 2 or 3 years ago. I really like that. And I do think it shows very real evolution from this group that has benefited them in a big way.
Yeah, I mean, 29%, 12 personnel last season, 2
Yeah.
tight ends. That's up from I put up 12%, which was 27th in the league a year before. So that was a pretty significant evolution. I was really excited by what I saw from Eric All, who was the rookie they drafted, who got hurt, and I think
I hope he comes back healthy.
Yeah, would be a really interesting because Gesicki's, he's a big slot, but like, he's more of a receiver than a tight end rather. But I think that gives them the opportunity to be a little bit more multiple, do a little bit more in the run game. They were good running the ball with the tight ends on the field, and I think it's not that subtle. It's actually a pretty big jump, but this is an offense that we had kind of thought was like going to look the same way forever, and yeah, there's like little tweaks here and there. The way they weaponized Jamar Chase last season, moving him around, playing him from every possible spot, was a huge part of why he had such a dominant season. And then the quarterback became a better quarterback. I mean, I feel like I didn't even talk about this when I talked about the offense, but I thought Joe Burrow was the best he's ever been. The way he navigated the pocket, dealt with pressure, some of the playmaking. He's still really young. So, I think if you're a Bengals fan, you're really excited about the continued evolution of him as a player. And I want to emphasize that because I just think with some of these, like, we have, the big four, as I call them, with, Mahomes, Allen, Jackson, Burrow, we kind of think of them as being, okay, they are who they are, but they're still growing. They're really, really young group. The best 4 quarterbacks in the NFL are all still young. It's unbelievable. So anyways, I just wanted to mention that as well with Joe Burrow, because I think like there's a possibility yet that he could unlock another level that we haven't seen.
There's no denying that. And I think that's what's been so cool about watching those guys over the last couple of years. Mahomes is weird because he threw 50 touchdowns before he was a fully formed player.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's been harder to appreciate his evolution and growth because it hasn't necessarily been an evolution and growth in how good he is. He's just been good in a slightly different way. With Allen, Mahomes, and Burrow, I think it's been an evolution in literally how much value they're providing as quarterbacks. And I think that has been very cool. Obviously, what Lamar did last year and like what he's done as a passer is absurd. Like his it's not even like timing in the pocket. It's just like feel for the pocket and just like understanding when he needs to make certain decisions. He just feels like so in command of the offense now. And with Burrow and Allen, obviously it's the decision making and like what's happening between the ears. And with Burrow, I 100% agree. Like watching him navigate the pocket last year and just some of that playmaking gene. It was just one of those things where you're just like, what is happening? Like how is he doing this on top of everything else he already does well? And that's what's so frustrating about this stupid football team. If he wasn't that, and they weren't capable of what they did last year, I wouldn't care about the stuff that they do poorly. But there's just a version of them out there that's like an era-defining sort of franchise, and them consistently shooting themselves in the foot to not be that is what frustrates me about this team.
How do you feel about the guard situation?
You talked about them spending more money on defense and some of the free agents they could have gotten. My problem with, and this is a whole rabbit hole we don't need to go down, but if you look at the cap hits for T. Higgins and Jamar Chase, they're the same as they would have been before signing those extensions. That's not how contracts should work in the NFL and cap management should work. Like in theory, there should be $10 to $12 million more in cap space for this team than there was.
Guarantees, yeah.
That money should go to Kevin Zeitler. Imagine if Kevin Zeitler was the right guard on this team for 1 year and $10 million, $1 million more than he made from the Titans. And Dylan Fairchild was playing left guard. You had Amarius Mims coming in as your right tackle in year 2. You still had Ted Karras and you still had Orlando Brown. How much better would you feel right now if that was Kevin Zeitler instead of Lucas Patrick?
A lot. It was a problem last year. That was one of the many problems covered up by the Joe Burrow deodorant. And where I think it continues to be a problem is I'm still skeptical of this run game overall. I know Chase Brown's better than Zach Moss. I understand that he was able to put up decent yardage, but I still think that the run blocking restricts this team from making defenses respect the run in any ways. And they placed a ton of light boxes. So they faced the 5th most light boxes in football, unsurprising. They ran into them just 26% of the time. Which is, I think, was second worst to the Raiders, second lowest. It's so hard to live that way. You're asking so much of the passing attack.
I think you can make an optimistic case, though, that last year was sort of an outlier when it came to the efficiency of the run game for this team, because their issue on the ground before last season wasn't about being able to run the ball consistently. They could do that. It's that they had absolutely no explosive element on the ground whatsoever. I mean, this is a team that was up. I don't know if it was near the top of the league, but they were consistently, like, for 2 straight years in the top 10 in, like, rushing success.
Were basically the same.
Exactly. And that's what we're talking about. And so I think, and last year, the offensive line was never good, right? It was never a strength of this team. But there was a stretch where when you had Jonah Williams at right tackle and you had Alex Kappa playing reasonably well before the injury, that it was an acceptable group. Last year, the wheels came off. Kappa, like, completely bottomed out. That problem at left guard has been a consistent issue for a long time. Amarius Mims was a rookie. He was hurt for the beginning of the season. If Dylan Fairchild comes in and is solid, and the right guard is essentially what it's been at left guard for the last couple of years, and Mims takes a step forward, I think there's a way for this team to get back to the sort of running game they were a couple of years ago. And now you have an explosive back with Chase Brown. So I think that's the optimistic case to be made. Was last year the outlier year in this team's ability to run the ball at least consistently, even if they're never going to be a team that's going to grind you down on the ground?
Let's do the Ravens, but let's talk about them in a different way, because I've spent a lot of time talking about both this offense and this defense over the last 2 weeks and why they're so good and why I think I had the Ravens. I'll tell you what, I had the Ravens as the number 1 offense and I had them as the number 3 defense, which might seem a little optimistic. I don't know, but it's not like when you look at the second half numbers for the Ravens defense, you're like, oh, right. Yeah, right. And I think they got better. So what not?
They were number 1 in defensive success rate in the second half of the season.
Yeah. And EPA, it was quite the transformation. So my question for you is, if you're a Ravens fan, what is the number 1 thing keeping you up at night right now?
You have to be so nitpicky about it, by the way. Like, you have to be so nitpicky about it. I would say,
and obviously Lamar Jackson getting hurt or something like that. Yeah.
Offensively, there's just not much. I mean, maybe you could say, okay, like, what happens at that left guard spot this year? Like, Voorhees, obviously, McCary was a stabilizing factor for them last year. Yeah. You draft Emory Jones. Like, is that going to be enough? Do you have enough offensive line depth? Yeah. Can you figure those spots out? But I think last year they really deserved the benefit of the doubt because there was a lot of panic about that offensive line heading into the season last year, and all of it was unfounded. It was the best offense in the league.
Week 1, I remember watching them against Chiefs and being like, ooh, I don't know about this offense. It looked like a real mess. And then it just gelled as the year went on. And by the end, they were excellent.
I think they deserve a lot of benefit out there. So on offense, I don't really have that many concerns. I mean, like, I don't know, maybe you still feel that lack of a ball-winning receiver, but I think that Hopkins gives you like an Aguilar plus and a slightly different skill set than you've had in the past with that spot. So I'm not that worried about most elements of the offense. There are 2 things. Let's go 2 things I'll point out on defense. Okay. I think that my favorite part of the Malachi Starks pick, when Ardarius Washington was healthy, is the flexibility that it provides you on the back end. I love how this team operates. Like, there's their ability to put out fires, and I think differently and pivot is really interesting. So in order to combat that, they go out and get Jair Alexander. And so now your hope is we're taking 2 bites at the apple at the other outside corner spot. So if Chidobe or Jair hits, and we have that spot locked down with Nate Wiggins, we can just play Marlon Humphrey in the slot all the time and not worry about it. So I think that they'll probably be okay even with the Ardarius Washington thing, but they have way less flexibility because now you're in a spot where the makeup of your roster almost necessitates you play Kyle Hamilton at safety full time. And I think that takes away from the defense to an extent. But that's, again, nitpicking. And the other spot I would say is that other inside linebacker spot. Because when you got deeper into the season last year, I think you felt the fact that Trenton Simpson never really materialized for them, and Malik Harrison is a really limited player. And so if Trenton Simpson again fails to kind of come into his own, if the Teddy Buchanan, who they drafted in the 4th round. If that continues to be an issue and teams can pick on that, we saw their lack of an answer at that spot in the playoff game against the Bills last year when the Bills just
Yep.
ran it down their throat. So I think those are probably the 2 spots I would say, because I believe in Mike Green's ability to help the pass rush in the way that they need. And so I think if those are the 2 issues you're most worried about heading into a season, you're probably feeling pretty good about that side of the ball.
So mine is pretty aligned with yours, because I think the thing about the offense too is they're just so deep. I mean,
Yeah.
like like people forget that Zay Flowers didn't play in the playoff game at the end of the year, right? Like their number one wide receiver didn't play, and yeah, it's just they're very deep, very multiple. Obviously, the quarterback is unbelievable. Defensively, I'm looking at the loss of Michael Pierce and a potential decline in the play of Roquan Smith. That would be the thing, and it absolutely connects to what you saw in the playoffs against Buffalo. They didn't really replace Michael Pierce in a way that I feel great about. Travis Jones is a player I really like. I like him a lot as a pass rusher. And then Roquan, you already said it about Trent Simpson. Roquan had some tough games last year. Now, I think he kind of quietly turned things around, and I think there's a litany of reasons for that. And some of it has to do with what was going on behind him as well. But I do worry, he's getting older. What if the linebacker group of this team is no longer a strength? What if, because so much of what they do on defense structurally with their pressures is contingent on having, it's not just linebacker, it's the spine. And Kyle Hamilton and I talked about this last year. Like everything they do is built around the idea of having a dominant spine. What happens if the front end of that is no longer dominant? I still think they're going to be great. I had them as the 3rd best defense. I'm just saying, what is the thing you're slightly worried about if you're Ravens?
It's a great thing to bring up. I think that's exactly right. And you have the linebacker question, and you have the run defense in the middle of the defense question. And not replacing a guy like Michael Pierce, you think, all right, how important is that? But they don't really have. Travis Jones is a big body, but that's not really how he's affecting the game. I think him as a pass rusher is more intriguing and a little bit more impactful than what he's doing as a run defender at this point in his career. And John Jenkins, I think, had some decent stretches for the Raiders over the last couple of years. This is like a very weird thing, but I kind of enjoyed the John Jenkins, Adam Butler combination for the Raiders over the last couple seasons, but
Sicko.
He's 34 years old at this point. And so I think them not being a little bit more aggressive in trying to add to some depth there may come back to bite them. But again, we're really nitpicking here. Like if Roquan Smith plays at the level that he's capable of playing at, I think all of this stuff starts to matter just a little bit less.
He's older. He's 28. He's not,
No.
he's still under 30. Linebackers still play at a high level at that age. I really did think like there was a point, and I don't remember what game it was, but there was a point in the beginning of the season where I was like, should we be worried about Roquan? I don't know if you felt the same way. And then it kind of went away and you just forgot about it, and he started doing more Roquan things as the year went on. So not worried. I also this is year 2 Zach Orr, right? He thrown into the fire with great expectations last year, made a tremendous midseason change that I'm sure your show, my show, every show's talked about. They've added, I think Chuck Pagano was hired as the part of the defensive coaching staff, which is interesting. This coaching staff is tremendous. I mean, on the offense pod, I think I spent like way too long talking about how much Todd Monken was in his bag last season. And he's back. Like the continuity that they have, the talent that they showed, the creativity on both sides of the ball is just outrageous, coaching wise.
I think John does a better job managing his staff over a long period of time than any coach in the NFL over the past decade, because Dan Campbell's done a really good job of it so far, but Dan Campbell's never had to replace coordinators yet. I mean, this is the first test we're going to get. And I always made this comparison where I think that these kind of CEO type coaches who have been long-standing coaches, inevitably you're going to have to make these sorts of tweaks because guys get hired away or because things are starting to get stale. And I think John has done a really, really good job at it in a way that Pete struggled with in Seattle. I think Pete tried to make those same sorts of changes and he was never able to hit them. And if you look at the feel that John Harbaugh has had for how to figure out the right coordinators for the right players on his team time and time again, even like going to Greg Roman when he did in 2019 and understanding that was the right choice at the time. And then understanding when it was time to move on from Todd Monken because they needed to take that step forward. Understanding even if they had a lot of success with Wink, all right, this has run its course. Like, we're not going to be able to thrive playing the style of defense anymore. How do we take the next step? He's just done a phenomenal job doing that. And that's what a head coach in his sort of role that's not calling the offense or the defense has to be really good at.
The roster is just also so well constructed in that it's like such a nice blend of proven players and young players who have started to break out, who are probably going to are likely to hit their primes. Two guys who I would single on each side of the ball: Nate Wiggins on defense and Isaiah Likely on offense. I think both of those dudes can be absolute stars, and both have shown it. And again, when we think about why this team is so good, yes, we can say, well, on defense, Marlon Humphrey's getting up in the years. He was amazing last year, of course, in the slot. Offensively, it's like, oh, well, Mark Andrews is also getting a little older. Yeah, but they have incredible youth at both of those positions. So, I just feel like, when we're picking nits on a team like this, you're really, to go back to, maybe not the Steelers, but you're looking at older players and saying, can they continue playing? And I think with the Ravens at the high level, the answer is even if they fall off a little bit, there's reinforcements at every position except linebacker. That's the one where I'm like, oh, that, which is why I brought it up. The one thing I'll bring, and I know this has been a little bit more 30,000 foot than what we've been talking about with the other teams. I think that if I'm the thing that actually, in addition to what I talked about, maybe keeps me up at night is just winning the preseason year after year, getting so close, and then losing in ways that can't easily be explained or addressed has the potential to wear on you psychologically as an organization. I interviewed Marlon Humphrey about this. That's going to come out in a couple weeks. And he was so insightful about we can say, oh, they don't really care. He was he talked about how devastating it was because they knew how good they were and how it took him so long to get over it. It's really, really interesting to hear him talk about that. That's hard, man. This was the best team in football at various points. And I know Eagles fans, by the end of the season, you're the better team, but it's really hard to get over that every year and to come back and say, this is our year.
There's no doubt. And I think there was a stretch 2 years ago where you could argue they were the best team in the league. I mean, just think about what they did to the Niners on Christmas 2 seasons ago when we thought that Niners team was just cruising, to potentially win the Super Bowl, but at least be in it.
This is going to be the best football game of all time. And then the Ravens just curb stomped them.
We talked about this on our show this week, it was about Lamar specifically, but also about Josh Allen, just what this has to be like. How you continue to figure out where that motivation is going to come from. And even beyond the motivation, it's at what point do the first 18, 19 games of the season just cease to matter to you?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how they go, because if the ending is still the same as it's been the last couple of years, it's all for naught anyway. And it's a weird nihilistic way to think about a game and a job that's really hard to come to and do well every single day. So I think it's inevitable. It's just human nature. It's going to wear on you.
I think where it matters for the Ravens and how you make it feel like it matters. It's funny because we always talk about the Chiefs using the regular season to experiment and, not getting deterred by the offense being slow at times. I think for the Ravens, you have to account for the fact that last season you basically lost the number 1 seed because your defense was poorly constructed the first half of the season, and you missed a bunch of freaking game-winning field goals. So, I mean, that's again, talking about nitpicking, let's go on the other way. Hopefully, if they have a kicker now who doesn't miss a bunch of incredibly important kicks, you have the potential to, not lose in stupid ways. So I think this is the first time I've talked about kicking or special teams this offseason, but that's a big deal. Justin Tucker single-handedly lost them games last year, Robert. we never talk about special teams because it's boring to talk about and we're not going to analyze it, but like he was guilty of that and other things.
Well, the kicker that they drafted this year has missed like a bunch of kicks in OTAs. So it seems like the kicking competition is going to be more of a story than it should be. The last thing I'll say about this is my Zag take is that it was a good thing for the Ravens fans are still pissed about it. Like there were people in my mentions this week talking about how Lamar or the Josh Allen MVP was a pity MVP, whatever. But my Zag take is that it's actually a good thing for the Ravens that Lamar did not win the MVP. Because now you can do this like weird twisted thing where he feels
Nobody
slighted.
believes in us.
If he had won 2 in a row, is it actually a bad thing for the Ravens Super Bowl chances? I'm sticking with that.
We do an awards pod every year, and I feel like Lamar MVP is, because he didn't get it last year, is a great bet for, I don't know what the odds are. I haven't looked at them for next year because so much of it is narrative driven. But yeah, I love that. I love that, Zach, about the Ravens being extra motivated because they were spurned and because they lost to the Bills. So there is legitimate week 1, man. Whew, buddy. Week 1. Crazy.
Are they playing each other in week 1?
Yes.
Oh man,
Wait,
you'll learn this about me. I don't know when any of the games are happening. Like
yes,
you can tell me that any game is happening at any point.
The only reason I know this is because I just had to look at the schedule because NFL Live is on site for pretty much every Monday night game, and week 1 is Chicago for us, which is such a gift to go to Chicago in September and not in November or December. So
you're welcome,
gods. But yeah, I was looking at the week 1 schedule and I was like Ravens Bills, and I did like a slow wolf whistle, like all the narratives, all of it. It's going to be amazing. It's Sunday Night Football, which is crazy.
Sunday Night Football. Okay, good. Because I knew because I wasn't sure if there were those 2 Monday games in week 1. And if it was one of those Monday games, I was going to be bummed because I think I'm going to go to Bears Vikings in week 1. I think I'm going to go to the game.
Say hi.
My wife has never been to an NFL game before. It's going to be September instead of December. And in week 1, the season isn't over. Like I won't have lost my will to live. And
will you lose your will to live if JJ McCarthy puts up 40 points on you?
As long as the offense scores 35 and that sort of loss, I think I'll be okay with it.
All right. Well, it's only the Vikings defense. Anyways, okay, final note on this. I always do rank the teams. I feel like this division is not particularly divisive. It's very 2 halves. Well, I guess not really because the Steelers did come close to but Ravens, Bengals, Steelers, Browns, I imagine you're aligned.
Mine's the same way. I just think that offense is sticky. We know that, right? And I think the Bengals offense, what they did last year, like it's going to be weirdly lost to history, like how good that passing game was all of last season. And so them even coming close to that this year, if the defense cannot actively be like one of the 3 worst defenses in the league, I do believe that they have the makings of at least a wild card team. Yes.
All right, that's it for this week. Thank you again to Robert for joining us. Go check out the Athletic Football Show. It is excellent. We're going to be continuing this twice a week cadence now that we're in July with the Power Hours. I think I have a special pod with Dan Orlovsky coming out soon, maybe on Monday. And we're going to do another division next week. So yeah, thank you also, as always, to the folks at Omaha Productions, Kirsten Sebecki, Anthony Jimenez, Owen Saylor, Jack Foster, Tucker Tashton. If you were listening to this in audio, you can also check it out at youtube.com/@MinaKimes, where I have interviews with players that I've been posting. The Marlin one will be coming out soon. Also, if you're watching Love Island, check out my Love Island recap pod with David Dennis Jr. Viewer discretion. We are in peak Love Island season right now.
Wow!